The Vessel. Episode 25. Abscido. Zane felt good. The holy day was going just as planned, the thought of which made him smile the smile of the righteous, the warmth filling up his eyes and seeping under his skin. He felt indestructible, his bones reinforced with purpose and truth. Thanks to the boy, their genius, their secret weapon only a few men knew about, his smile was being broadcast from his wrist to every corner of the Ark, on every available screen and hollow. "Greetings, fellow Ark passengers," he said, "and a happy Reclamation Day to you." He took a deep breath, savoring the moment. Captain Ashby seized the opportunity to rudely interrupt him, shouting through the hollow to be heard. He called for her to be muted but not cut off, because he wanted her to see this. "As I was saying, I'm Zane Nolan, and I'm here to welcome you to your new life with us, your new friends and saviors, the children of Eden." The others in mining buzzed with excitement, as the rest throughout the ship would be doing. He continued, "By now, you've surely seen some things which have given you some concerns regarding the current events of this ship, as well as your place on it. You've noticed my fellow children rounding up every man, woman, and child on the Ark, and it worries you. If nothing else, I'm here to tell you this. You have nothing to worry about. In fact, you should be excited for the days to follow. We're standing right now on the edge of a new era, a time of renewed faith and hope on the Ark. I have no doubt that you're feeling confused, lost. But then, you've been lost for some years, haven't you?" His eyes stung with a welling of angry tears. "We all have, thanks to the people who threw us out into space all those years ago, and more recently, people like Captain Ashby here," he pointed to her muted hollow, "who have blindly followed the orders of those long-dead men and women, taking us further and further from the touch of God's divine light. We've suffered alongside you. We've endured the cold and the hunger with you, and it has taken its toll on us." At this point, Peabody began to sway on his feet from blood loss. It reminded Zane of an important point, and he was thankful for the reminder. He showed the man to the people of the Ark. "On the other hand," his voice shifted, becoming cold, "do not confuse our suffering for weakness. We welcome you by our sides, yes, but only by our sides. If you do not stand next to us, you're most certainly across from us, and that is a place I do not recommend standing." He smiled again. "All this is to say, hang on, endure the cold just a little longer. The coming days will be difficult, yes. They'll scare and bewilder you, and at times you'll wish for your old life back. But my promise to you is this. If you stay with me, if you give us a chance, you'll soon know peace like you've never known it before." Zane cut the line. His fellow children cheered and applauded, satisfied by his speech. A moment later, he unmuted the captain's hollow. "Do you honestly think the people of this ship will just roll over and accept your command?" she asked. "I suspect there will be some losses. Resistance is a part of human nature." He looked over at Peabody, then back to the captain. "They'll come to see what we offer. In the end, they'll thank us for what we did today." "And what exactly do you offer?" "The true path." Ashby scoffed. "To death, maybe." He grinned. "No, Captain. To eternity." On that true and final word, the lights in mining went out. The expansive deck was plunged into darkness, lit only by strips and panels of emergency bioluminescence. It was a blackout. Not all power, but most of it. The ambient light on Captain Ashby's holographic face dimmed, proving the bridge to be affected as well. Why did you turn off the lights? She asked him. I didn't, Zane replied. Given their previous experience with elevators, Nikolai and Cash decided to take the stairs. It would be a long haul from Deck 14 all the way up to the medbay on 3, especially without the aid of an elevator. But fortunately, there was a secondary medbay on 11 for just such emergencies. They needed to reach it before Monica went into shock, or worse. Nikolai had tried calling into the station to inform them of their emergency, but no one had picked up the call. Strange, but he could only imagine how many fires, both figurative and literal, the other officers were currently dealing with. Cash carried the woman in his arms. He was the smaller of the two men, but he'd insisted. Nikolai looked at the burnt woman in his partner's arms. We have to call her husband, he said. The hell we do. We don't have time for that. He needs to know what's going on. You would want to know. Cash frowned. You do it then. I don't want to talk to that loser. If Nikolai didn't know better, he'd say there was a tinge of jealousy there. Nikolai called Des, who picked up before a name was able to pop up on the display. Monica? His voice was strained, panicked. It's Nikolai, but I have Monica. Oh, thank God, Des said. I haven't been able to get through to her. I woke up and everything was crazy. Des. Nikolai stopped the man. She's hurt. There was a pause on the line. What happened? Not really sure. There was an explosion in engineering. That's all we know. It's these Edenist assholes. I'll kill every damn one of them if she... He stopped himself this time. How bad is it? Bad. But Sun says if we can get her help, she has a chance. We're heading to the secondary medbay on 11. He considered showing Des his wife on the holo, but decided it would only further panic the guy. All right, I'll head there now. All I can say is you'd better make it. We'll make it. Nikolai prepared to end the call. And Des, he added, how do you know it was the Edenists who set it off? Another pause. You don't know. Nikolai glanced up at Cash, who was busy pretending he wasn't listening to the conversation. Know what? The bastards are taking over the ship. After he'd hung up, Nikolai returned to his partner's side. Cash looked up from the dying woman in his arms. He's still a loser, Cash concluded. The men continued their climb, both noticing they hadn't run into anyone along the way. It appeared no one wanted to go toward the massive explosion, a choice that didn't surprise them in the least. They'd only gotten as far as Deck 13 when the lights went out. What the hell is this now? Cash sighed in the darkened stairway. Good thing we didn't take the elevator. The explosion must have caused more damage than we thought. Nikolai turned on his light. At the next landing, he checked a darkened door panel, finding the lock to be on manual-only mode. Cash shook his head. So do we call it in? I'm sure they already know what's going on. And if they don't, he added, they will soon. James Crick knew peace. As an all-cleric, he carried not just one god in his heart, but many. He brought their life-saving words through the cosmos, a torchbearer of the highest order. Crick welcomed with open arms all that allowed themselves to be illuminated by the transformative power of belief. It had been many years since he'd first heard of the Children of Eden, mentioned in passing during a conversation with a passenger. His initial doubt gave way to curiosity about the new ways religion could form in deep space, so far from their original home. What he imagined at first would be akin to mold growing in a dark, damp basement turned out to be a personal awakening for Crick, the second in his life and the most powerful by far. Zane Nolan, practically a teenager then, had impressed in him a deep love for God in a way that felt new and fresh. In their faith, he found all that he'd been seeking, The purpose of his life brought further into focus than it had ever been. Here was belief existing not against science, not in spite of it, not even alongside it, but because of it, intertwined with it until they were indistinguishable from one another. Here was faith not in theory, but in fact, in living and breathing form. Here was God in the flesh. Over time, he'd won over all but the most analytical of his fellow all-clerics, those few who didn't allow the love of God past their minds and into their hearts. Their doubt became especially pronounced once the children began to waver in their worship of the all-knowing Blackwood and his foretold vessel. They took the shift in doctrine as a sign of insecurity, yet where they saw flaws and cracks, Crick saw evolution. This faith was young and fruitful, and an apple still growing was subject to rapid change and transfiguration. Those few, the doubters among them, would likely have to die in the coming times. It seemed a waste of perfectly good people, but then there was always need for sacrifices. Now, darkness had seized the Ark, not so much a total loss of power, the kind poor Captain Ashby was currently being subjected to, as it was a shutdown of several main systems by an unknown party. Several of their fellow children had been eagerly trying to turn the lights back on for the past few minutes. Apparently, according to the men who knew such things, it was ship-wide, a rolling failure that had spread across the entire ship. Even with the boy genius on their side, they'd been unable to recover the lights. Whispers rose up from the shadows, men gasping and praying. Crick heard Zane ask what the matter was, but heard no reply. They were all entranced by a dark form approaching from the far end of the deck. It moved in twitches and slides, uneven amounts of a man twisting toward them in growling motion. A man, twice Crick's size, shouted something about the prophecies, the ones they all knew and feared even as they swore not to. And yet, as the shape moved closer, revealing itself to them, this entwined column of man and something more, Crick knew, as the others did, that it could be nothing other than the very thing they'd long feared and denied. The abnormal ones, Crick joined in their whispers. The thing spasming toward them was naked, not just of clothes, but mostly of skin as well, with one arm 3 times the size of the other. Not just an arm, an undulating tentacle like those of a cephalopod, complete with circular, bowl-shaped suckers covering the bottom half. The suckers showed up elsewhere on the creature's body, bursting forth like cancerous polyps from the angry flesh of its legs and belly, and along other indescribable formations. Crick's eyes moved up the creature, dragging along the exposed musculature that rose up its neck and hatched like devil's finger fungus to become the staging of a human face. But it wasn't just any face. Everyone not living in Cryopod knew it. That face had been everywhere the last week, on screens all over the ship and at every public gathering. But Crick knew it more intimately than that. Just a few weeks earlier, he himself had spoken to the man that owned that face. It was Baptiste. Somewhere nearby, a man began to scream. Captain Ashby had been watching the feed in horror. The mutiny had been more than enough to deal with, complicated only slightly further by the sudden loss of lighting systems. But now, standing on a bridge faintly lit by yellow-green bioluminescence, she stared at what details she could pick out from the monstrous figure stomping through the shadows of the mining deck. That thing slink-stepping toward the men and women trying to take her ship from her. As she watched the way its octopoidal limbs slapped against its own reddened flesh, there was just one thing she knew with certainty. Whatever it wasn't human. Not entirely. Ashby glanced back at the others sharing the darkened bridge with her. First Officer Oberlander seemed to have briefly forgotten his hands were tied behind his back as he stared wide-eyed at the scene playing out via her screen. Hopes, too, that traitorous leech, was entranced by what he saw in the hollow. Side by side, sharing in the same terror, it was easy to forget that moments ago they were cursing and shouting at one another, two men on either side of a power grab. Until she looked lower, closer, at the young man on the floor. The blood flow from his stomach had stopped, the color gone from his skin. His eyes were unfocused, and his chest, the one bearing the name tag she herself had affixed to his uniform on his first day of service, had sunken in and gone still. Officer Pagani was gone, murdered at the hands of a man he trusted. Murdered by hopes. Ashby felt a tug deep inside her gut. Like the explosion that had taken out her engineering deck, it detonated, radiating outward until it had consumed every inch of her, incinerating all in its path. With a pressure building in her chest, she ran at Hopes the liar, Hopes the betrayer, Hopes the murderer, screaming all the way. One minute, Dr. Hannigan had been following Sun's instructions to open the launch door controls, pull the panel forward, extend the manual override knob, spin to charge, and the next, complete chaos erupted on Deck 8. From where she was tucked away, in the corner nearest the massive airlock doors, Hannigan's greatest worry was being seen by the Edenists. But then came the screaming, the shouts and scuffling echoing in the dark as machinery and storage devices were knocked into and over. In seconds, men and women were reduced to children, appropriate considering their group's self-chosen name, but disconcerting nonetheless, and she wanted to know why. Her first thought was that someone was fighting back against the Edenists, peace officers, or just concerned passengers taking it upon themselves to stop the uprising. But that didn't explain the tone of their voices, the superstitious fear mixed with primal panic, nor did it explain the growling and slurping. Then, Hannigan saw it. It walked upright like a man, yet from there the design deviated severely. It stumbled out of the shadows, its balance off-center due to its uneven anatomy. Like a crab with one larger, weaponized arm, its slimy, cancerous organ danced on the air. "Dear God," she uttered. "What is that?" "I must insist that you focus on the task at hand," Sun said, as if she could just brush off such a thing. One of the braver Edenists had stepped forward to try and stop the creature, but he was unceremoniously knocked out of the way. His head connected with the ground in such a way that it caused a sick thump. The man convulsed twice, his legs flopping against the metallic ground, then stopped. Was this the animal responsible for the arm in her medbay? The one that had killed Baptiste Marlowe? "Doctor," Sun urged. Okay. She returned her attention to the panel, but found her hands shook when she tried to work the controls. She cursed them. "Can't you do this?" she asked Sun. "I cannot. You are doing a sufficient job." "It's always been my goal to be sufficient," she thought. As the shouting and running continued, she followed Sun's instructions. First, she powered up the screen, then navigated its dim menus as told by the invisible man in her ear. Menu to submenu, routine to subroutine, she became the conduit for Sun's violations against his own human protection laws. Ventilation command lockdown. O2 feed command disengage. Barometric control command 6. Over her shoulder, she witnessed a second Edenist try and fail to stop the monster. This man, too, was knocked aside like an unwanted doll. As she continued to follow the instructions spoken to her by Sun, she felt a sudden throbbing in her temples, a sensation like someone was trying to push her eyeballs into her skull. "Why is my head pounding?" she asked. Before Sun could answer, she checked the readout on the screen in front of her. "Hold on. The air pressure's increasing." "Correct," Sun said, as if addressing his prize student. This program was designed for situations requiring emergency elimination of contaminated materials. Then, perhaps sensing that Hannigan didn't fully grasp the situation, added, "The program engages rapid decompression of the launch zone." "Oh," Hannigan said. Then, "Shit. When activation is complete, I would warn you to find something sturdy to hold on to." She scoffed. "Now you warn me," she said, not caring if Sun couldn't process sarcasm very well. A few seconds later, she reached the final command. Hannigan looked at the screen under her hovering finger. It flashed 3 words at her, the same 3 words again and again, followed by a question mark. Normally, it was the most banal and harmless of questions, but just then it felt like the hardest question she'd ever been asked. "Are you sure?" She heard a man begging shamelessly for his life. Drawn to the panicked voice, she looked up in time to see the half-invertebrate monster rip all Cleric Crick's arm out of its socket, uniform and all. A scream erupted from the man as he fell to the floor, full of the most gut-wrenching pain imaginable. Even for a doctor with emergency training, it was a wretched and guttural sound, the likes of which she'd never heard. As the creature descended on Crick, intent on finishing the job, Dr. Hannigan caught sight of what passed for its face. In that half-second, that momentary glimpse, everything changed. This wasn't the beast responsible for what had become of the teacher, Baptiste Marlowe. It was Baptiste Marlowe. Without hesitation, Hannigan turned back to the screen and pressed yes. As she turned to run to find something sturdy to hold on to, the door override alarm began to reverberate like a hammer inside her skull. Gunnar was tired of waiting. After listening to Svarog mumble nonsense to himself for countless minutes, he wanted nothing more than to get back inside the ship, take his boots off, and stick his foot directly up the ass of whichever cultist had stuck Gunnar out there with the lunatic. Floating next to the control panel, he had already completed his half of the emergency decompression sequence. All that was left was to wait for Dr. Hannigan to do her half. Sun had told them his plan, which, at this point, was their only hope. Gunnar admitted some disappointment when he heard who was to be their co-conspirator on the inside. Just because she was a brilliant doctor didn't mean she could do what they needed her to do, any more than Gunnar, being the best fabricator on the Ark, meant that he could paint a landscape. This little job was way outside her lane, and even DeSanto, who seemed to have a soft spot for the doctor, didn't look thrilled when he found out whose face was on the card up Sun's sleeve. There went Svarog again, babbling cultist nonsense with his eyes shut tight. "He came to me in my sleep, in a dream, a waking dream. The Creator told me, he and the vessel will lead us there. Holy light and holy flesh, recycled and reused." "Why me?" DeSanto suddenly asked Svarog. Svarog's eyes shot open, the pupils dilated like an open door. What do you mean?" "Why am I the vessel? What makes me so different from anyone else on the Ark?" DeSanto seemed to be growing tired of the games. "I don't know," Svarog replied in a confessional tone. DeSanto's eyes widened. "You don't know? You can't do the things you've done without understanding why." His voice was like boiling water about to spill over. "I can if I have faith," Svarog replied. "Without faith, I have nothing. Without faith, I am nothing." At that, DeSanto's features loosened. Whether he understood or pitied the man, Gunnar was unsure. "Actiones secundum fide," DeSanto said, more to himself than anyone else. DeSanto didn't notice Svarog go pale at the words, but Gunnar did. The man looked as if he'd heard those words before. Gunnar was about to press the matter when he was interrupted, for once by something good. The door override alarm. The sound of it died before it was born, but the beacon light shone bright. 10 points to Hannigan! Gunnar shouted. He'd never doubted her for a second. Stay clear of debris, Sun warned, including bodies. Gunnar frowned. And just like that, I'm no longer excited. Slowly, like a lumbering titan, the doors began to open. Gunnar looked one last time onto the vast sea of stars all around them, trying to remember when he felt something for them. The truth was, aside from the obvious trepidation about what lay ahead, Gunnar was also curious what made DeSanto so special in the eyes of the cultists. Who would know? He asked Svarog. Svarog blinked. Who would know why he's the vessel? He looked at DeSanto, who nodded, perhaps appreciating his taking the situation seriously. Svarog stared at both of them in turn. The Creator, of course. And possibly Zane. He's the keeper of the Word. If any of us knows, it's him. Well, then let's go talk to him, Gunnar said. Then he leaned forward, propelling hard against the airflow trying to hold him back.